I'm Eliza Weber, and a lot of people call me Ellie, but my name is Eliza. So I'm going to give you a quick run-through on some of my bigger bodies of work and how it sort of relates to why I'm here and the research that I'm interested in doing here. So I'm originally from Great Falls, and of course growing up in Big Sky country, it's hard not to just fall in love with this place so deeply. So it has called me home every time I've been gone, and I made it back 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, after a decade away, and I'm not going anywhere now. So early on, I was making a lot of pottery. I actually went to undergrad with Stony in Missoula, so I finished at the University of Montana, and a lot of my imagery comes from nature, so I'm drawing rocks and clouds and flowers and trees, but a little abstract. And at the same time, I was making sculpture, so I've sort of always had one foot in each world, like functional and sculpture, which in ceramics is a little bit unusual because you're sort of forced into one direction, and I've kind of held down that I'm interested in both. So I'm bringing this work in because I was using a lot of fibers really early on in my work, and that thread has come back around pretty significantly. So using ceramic as sort of the main material throughout my work, but fibers and textiles have become a really important other material for me. So early on, ooh, that chair just like flipped directions. I put this in because early on also in undergrad, I was immediately starting to process what we would maybe consider waste. So all of my junk mail I was keeping for years, and as every month sort of I would process it into this really low-tech paper pulp in my backyard, and was making big sheets of paper on old window screens. And I was already starting to use a lot of different ways of dyeing materials, so paper and other fibers. And that's come back around a lot too. So after undergrad, I moved to Seattle, and I worked at a place called Pottery Northwest, which is mostly a functional ceramics studio, the oldest arts organization in Seattle, and I really wanted to just focus on making pots while I was there. So this is my culminating exhibition. And I put this in because this shifted my work in a lot of ways, because I was thinking about space more. So this white cube that we get as visual artists a lot, how do we deal with this white box as an installation or an exhibition space? And so right through this work, I was thinking a lot about how do I transform this space, or how does this space relate to place a little bit more. So I had painted the Olympics around the gallery in this sort of yellow color. And that was because that was the view I was looking at every day. And I put these in too because I had made this series of these appreciation plates where every day when I was walking to the studio, I was recording little moments that made me happy or smile or be appreciative. And this series is somehow coming back also right now. But I've moved around a little bit, and so I moved from there. I'll sort of tell you my route. After here, I went to Kansas to start grad school, and I put this slide in because I'm really interested in the details of life, these little details and moments where we get to reflect. I'm not sure why this cactus image flipped either, but this iron stain on the way that plants and weeds sort of creep these remnants of humanity. So back into grad school, I started bringing paper pulp back in, and I was making these flower bouquets. So I was using ceramic and paper pulp, and the pulp became a way of building that was borrowed from ceramics. So it's not a traditional way of using fiber as a paper pulp. I was no longer making sheets of paper, I was sculpting with it, which was all a technique based on hand-built in ceramics. And I made a whole lot of them. Wow, what happened? I don't know. There's a communication situation happening. That one's real weird, we'll just skip it. So I also put this in because I'm really interested in textiles. So mostly vintage textiles, flocked wallpaper, other imagery that's from like tin works, old ceramics, any kind of really textiles, applique, embroidery, weaving, cross stitch, and then tile work. I am really drawn to color and pattern. So in a lot of different places, I'm looking at that through architecture or women's craft, what was traditionally deemed women's craft, which I won't go too much into that, but it's a real underbelly in my work on sort of gender roles and how those play a part. I transferred actually in grad school, so I was in Kansas and then I moved down to Arizona. And in that shift, I started making things in multiples or parts more. So I put this piece in because it was sort of a shift of my work, thinking about how do I make these parts that come together. And this was bringing back sort of that display of the Olympic Mountains. How do I start to have place overlap in a space? So thinking about living room landscapes was this title of this series that I had started. And it was because I was moving a lot. And so my living rooms were becoming, they had these landscapes to them of sort of all my belongings and those objects. And that started to become sort of inspirational to me, but also thinking about sort of that impact of material on place and environment and on the individual. So this is my thesis exhibition, which was March 2020. So it didn't happen, which meant that it happened in September. So that was a real weird shift. The work didn't change too much in those 6 months because we lost access in a lot of ways. And that actually was really interesting, the tie of the content of the work. So I made this rainbow row of these bouquets, and you walked into this space, and I had the room sort of divided where I had these naturals, these sort of deemed natural materials that were creating these sort of pseudo installations, displays. I was thinking a lot about IKEA display, hyper-consumerism. I think a lot about consumerism. Almost all the materials were found or sort of recycled, repurposed waste. I was using a lot of dyed, so natural materials. So I was using the local flora to dye the pulp or fibers. And then the back wall had a lot of these bouquets on it. And this sort of central carpet in the middle kind of blended the two halves of the exhibition, which on the right side were sort of these synthetic materials. So these old tablecloths that I had dismantled and reassembled into these sort of pseudo quilts. So I was thinking a lot about wall and floor, carpet and wallpaper, or sort of photo or wall display versus like floor. So these spaces with dimension. And this little carpet in the middle was kind of to pull the two together. So they're Palo Verde blossoms, which is the dark yellow, which is the state tree in Arizona. And then that's all plastic regrind, the white and the brighter yellow. So I put these in because one of the series I'm working on here are kind of expanding on these as wallpaper. So I'm actually using found wallpaper to deconstruct and then reassemble into sort of these quilts. So coming soon in the cabin. And this was sort of the back look, walking out. So the back wall had these recycled mirrors, these broken mirrors actually that I was collecting. And then I would pulp the edges. I wanted there to be this sort of reflective interaction with the viewer at the end. And the exhibition was titled Somewhere Over. So there was a lot of layers with the Wizard of Oz and this idea of the metaphor of the rainbow, symbolism of the rainbow. And this little artist book on the end listed every material in the whole exhibition on old receipt paper. So little artist books are another thing that I'll be working on here. I put this in because this was an exhibition that came about a year later, using also these Palo Verde blossoms, but it was mostly a collage exhibition, so I make a lot of collage as a way sort of to sketch. And then I was doing these cyanotypes. I'm really interested in the history of materials and how they move through time. And so a lot of times we don't know what a found object's history is, but all these ways that sort of I can follow a material till it's gone. So a lot of the times in my process, like with these collages, they were mapboard scraps, so they're the waste out of frame shops, and I was cutting these window shapes out. Then those became these sort of negative, or these positives that were the negatives from the collages that I ended up doing this real fun, playful thing on the wall that I'm really not sure what's happening still on that. I'll return to at some point someday. And then the cyanotypes were all of these negative cutouts from these collages that then I made sunprints of. And oh no, I'm sorry, all those flipped. The big Palo Verde blossom curtain, or carpet here in the middle, were collected blossoms that I had been collecting in my neighborhood for about 3 years. So I'm really interested in also archiving and how we document time and place through materials. So those came back around. This is a hard image to see, but this is another series in my studio I put in right now. These ones that are sideways. You can't see them, but this is something in my studio I'm working on in Helena right now, as I'm turning these collages into sculptures. So mimicking all of that pattern and color and surface onto those, but they're sideways, so sorry about that. So that's a real slow process that is happening in my studio, and I didn't bring any clay here. But back to sort of the natural material. So this is made out of the Palo Verde blossoms. This sculpture, all that brown pulp is all the flower pulp processed into a fiber pulp. And then these are ceramic flowers that are stained. So one of my main interests here is thinking about invasive species. Super sorry, all these verticals flipped on here. But I have been harvesting local plant material for a few years now. And coming back to Montana, one of my main interests is harvesting invasive species. I'm interested in this juxtaposition between invasive species and native species, but turning both of them into plant fiber and that I can then put into sculptures or installations. They're moving into more of a surface instead of the full form being made out of them, so the forms are actually clay and then I'm using the pulp on a surface. But I'm really interested in studying some more, learning more about invasive species here in Montana and even harvesting some while I'm here. So then I can start the drawing process, and then I've decided not to make any pulp here. It's just a pretty extensive process of breaking it down. But if anybody is interested in some extra hands, that's something I'm really interested in, and mostly on the flora side. So I am interested in the boat rides and the invasive water species there too. So this idea of how do I, because water is a huge part of my material actually too. So how do I use our water that is not treated and have it still be long lasting, or maybe it's ephemeral too. So my work is often thinking about this ephemeral impermanence, and that's partially just the play of material. That was a real quick run through, and you can find those images in better form on my website.